Very welcome at this lecture of Studium Generale, which was actually going to take place a week ago. Unfortunately, the speaker was ill, but fortunately, he was still another week in the Netherlands, so he could move it to this week. Fortunately, again, we could actually move to the bigger hall and have more audience in. So there were a lot of people on the standby list a week ago, but now we have room enough. I'm Rob van Duin, head of the Office of Studium Generale, and when the news came in September already about the protests in Iran, and it really got big, we started wondering, oh, we really need to address this issue and learn a bit more about what is happening and maybe discuss it with each other. It is always, of course, very difficult and then actually do it in that week. We plan 3 months ahead, and in this case also, the speaker who is working and living in the United States at this point isn't always in the Netherlands, and then when he is, he's quite busy with talk shows or interviews or talking about this issue. Before we start, I'm looking into what is happening in Iran and especially trying to catch some live things online, on social media or whatever. It really shocked me what is happening there, and especially at that moment where people are being tortured and people are being killed because of their protests without any good defense. It really is a difficult situation in Iran, but we tend to forget, you know, things go away, we have other issues in our own country, or maybe just across the border, or concerning the war in Ukraine. And I think it is, however, very important to look at these issues and discuss it here at the university. So, but now for the lecture that you all came for about Iranian Revolt, The Long Road to Freedom, by Peyman Jafari, a research fellow at the International Institute of Social History, Amsterdam, and assistant professor of history and international relations at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, US. Please welcome the historian Peyman Jafari.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Delara, for this moving story. Thank you, Rob, for organizing this timely event, and also thank you for showing up in these large numbers, although it is a cold evening in Maastricht. It has snowed here. I'm coming from Amsterdam and was surprised. And also thank you for your patience. Last week I was sick, and the organizers were very kind and flexible to move the session to today. Also, it's a great pleasure to be back in Maastricht, where I arrived in 1989 as a 12 years old boy with my parents. We were part of the refugee cohort that had fled Iran in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution and the Iran-Iraq war. I have very fond memories of going to the Trichter College. It was just down the road here, a high school here, maybe you have heard of it. And I am still very pleased to come back to Maastricht for its wonderful people, beautiful architecture, and great food that Rob just provided to us. Let me see. By the way, usually I like to really do this on the top of my head, but as also Delara was saying, most of us have been living a double life in the last 3-4 months. I have been teaching, researching, and then writing and giving lectures and meetings on Iran. So it's quite a lot in my head, and I had to put it on paper. Also because I'm going to lose quite a lot of specific data, information, and I don't want to make any mistakes with that. But I was saying that last time I was here at Studium Generale was actually in 2009 or 2010. Because of the Green Movement. Maybe some of you have heard of it. There were fraudulent elections in Iran, and there were mass-scale protests going on. I had just recently published my book, andere Iran, The Other Iran, in which I was trying to bring to life the rich history of social and political struggles in Iran and the domestic and foreign obstacles that they have met since the early 20th century. In the German edition of that book that came out a bit later, I added a new chapter on the 2009 crisis in Iran and argued that it had opened up a new phase in the history of the Islamic Republic. My point was that the 2009 crisis marked the emergence of revolts in Iran, but also of ruptures at the top of the political elite. And well, here we are again 13 years later, as the Islamic Republic faces another tremendous crisis, and its very legitimacy is challenged by the women life freedom protests that started last September. Looking at this new round of protests, I want to address 3 points in this talk. First, I want to give you an overview of how the protests have started, have developed, what their dynamics and different aspects are in terms of participants, demands, and so on. Right, because I can assume that maybe some of you have followed it very closely, but others maybe a bit more from a distance. Second, I will try to explain how we got to this point. Right, a bit of a historical background. Again, I'm a historian of modern history, but I will spare you. I will just go maybe like 40 years back, right? And then thirdly, I want to circle back to the protests and look what they actually mean. What is their nature? How can we conceptualize them, right? And where might they be heading? But let me first make 2 side notes about what difficulties we face when trying to make sense of what is going on in Iran. One difficulty is access to data, obviously, which has been made difficult by state repression, such as obstruction of the work of journalists, filtering and blocking the internet. That makes life really hard for scholars like me to get that. But nevertheless, we can get data. By the way, mainly through the courage activities of human rights activists, of journalists. For instance, the journalists who actually brought to light the death of Mahsa Amini are still in prison. So it is mostly actually Iranian journalists writing in Iranian newspapers that are providing us the information, and I want to acknowledge them because I always see that foreign TV, Iranian channels just grab their information and pretend that they are reporting, but it is really the work of people on the ground in Iran. Second difficulty is about interpretation. We are witnessing an unfolding and ongoing process, which means that it is actually too soon to say something very definitive and conclusive about it, right? We have to appreciate that this is also an open-ended process that we are in the middle of. And as a scholar, I'm always kind of careful of being too definitive, especially as a historian. We only now can understand the French Revolution, let alone like what is happening now in Iran. So there needs to be some time passing. But the third difficulty has to do with positionality of those of us who try to get a deeper understanding of the protests. The issue is that I and many of us are not neutral, but partisan towards the protests. I personally cheer its victories, mourn its losses and victims, and wish for its future success. But if cheering and chanting was enough, Rob would not have invited me. I'm sure there are better people who can chant for you. And I wouldn't need a 45-minute talk. I'm a historian and academic, and I'm asked to provide an assessment of the present conditions, not based on my personal wishes, but based on proper analysis that strives to be as good as possible objective and doesn't ignore complexity and nuance in the situation. Fortunately, and contradicting popular perception, I think it is possible for scholars and activists alike, by the way, to be both objective and take sides. Actually, I think it is often to the benefit of conflicts or social movements if we see their limitations and possibilities, right? And then help them move forward instead of imposing on them our personal wishes where we want them to go towards. So having made these side notes, let me move to the first question.
What has been going on in Iran since September? The protest started after Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, died on 16 September while in the custody of Iran's morality police. As her story and pictures started to circulate on social media, the public reacted with growing outrage. Her death sparked national-wide protests, which began during her burial in her Kurdish hometown, Saqqez. The slogan, Jin Jian Azadi, which is Kurdish, means woman, life, freedom, was first raised there in Saqqez, and it traveled then throughout Iran as Zan Zendegi Azadi. From September to December, tens of thousands of Iranians took to the streets chanting various slogans that targeted not only the lack of social and cultural freedoms, but also the very authoritarian nature of the political system in Iran. So you see the number of protests really peaking, and as you see, in the last few years, Iran has had many protests like any other country, the Netherlands, France, and so on. But really there is a peak. Is there a light on this? I think so, right? Usually there is. Is it? Wow. No. Oh, yeah, there. So you obviously see the peak here, and it continues. Well, I can't see it. Okay. You can see better than I can point out anyway. Then there is another peak in late October, in November, and then slowly the number of protests start to go down. And also in terms of geographical spread, this is a very kind of impressive movement. You see many cities from small towns actually to big towns of hundreds, thousands, and millions participated in these protests. So why are Iranians protesting? Like the Arab revolts of 2011, this is really a revolt for dignity and against humiliation. Some of that acts of humiliation we already heard about. And it is about reclaiming life, as my colleague Asif Bayat has coined this basic demand. It is about the right to be happy, to be young, to be treated with respect instead of being humiliated, to be free as a woman, and to live in equality and in social justice. So this is a revolt for bread, but roses as well. You have probably, some of you heard the song Baraye, made by Shervin Hajipur. If you haven't, look it up on YouTube. It is very impressive, and I think it gives you really in few minutes about what has actually moved so many Iranians to go onto the street, show courage in the face of so much repression, right? I don't have the space to go through the whole song, so I'm just giving you a snapshot. So it is for dancing in the alleyways, right? Because as a young person, you would like to do that. I'm sure you do that every night in Maastricht. But it's not allowed in Iran. It is the freedom to kiss your partner in public, which you can't do. It is about thinking freely, changing your mind. And that's obstructed. But it is also about not having a job, having social misery, and so on, so being broke. In short, it is about dignity, about having a normal life, as you define it, as you wish it to be. But one important element in the song as a whole is missing, by the way, that I do want to highlight. And that is the equality for Iran's ethnic communities, such as Kurds, Baluchis, Azeris, and Arabs, who have been discriminated against and marginalized, not only during the last 4 decades of the Islamic Republic, but also under the dictatorship of the Pahlavis. As Shervin Hajipur's song illustrates, what many Iranians are demanding requires not only reimagining a very different Iran, but also a different world. This is why the protests in Iran are part of a universal struggle for a different world. Take the following examples. The compulsory hijab in Iran, right? What is it about? It is basically about women's autonomy. It is the fact that women do not want their bodies to be the battleground of conservative men who want to impose on them the hijab in Iran, in the case of Iran. But I think it is also about the freedom of being able to wear the hijab in the West, because, for instance, that has been a debate as well. And once you take a different perspective and understand that what women in Iran, and this is an important thing, because some Islamophobic and right-wing parties have tried to hijack the protests in Iran to attack actually Muslim women in the West. That's why I'm highlighting this. Because beneath it, if you look even to Iran, women with hijab, many of them are supporting their daughters or sisters or family members who do not want to wear the hijab, right? It is about bodily autonomy. So it also extends to what is happening in the West, and in that sense you could say the debates in Iran are actually ahead of the debates in the West. Shervin Hajipur also refers to the environmental crisis in Iran, which is obviously caused by the mismanagement of the Iranian government, its developmentalist kind of projects that again started in the Pahlavis and were continued to today. But we also know that the climate change that is causing so much drought, not only in Iran, but also in Iraq and in many countries of the Middle East, is caused by a global system that prioritizes the profits of a minority above those of the planet and its people. Or take the economic problems. State policies, again, are at fault when it comes to Iran. But also Iran has gone through similar policies that have been implemented in many global South countries and in the West as well. I'm here referring to neoliberal policies that have created precarity for workers, for instance. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the Iranian case is not exceptional, and that solidarity is not a matter of pity for Iranians, right? It is a matter of walking towards our freedom together, seeing the same problems that Iranians are facing, obviously on very different level and from different perspectives, but that exists in many countries as well, and that creates a common ground. Let me unpack some of these issues a bit more in detail. So when it comes to women's grievances, I think, again, Delora gave many good examples. We can think about the compulsory dress code, the segregation in public spaces, the restrictions, but also the unequal rights in the judiciary, legal rights. For instance, women not having the right of the same heritage rights, right? Or keeping their kids, the man has the right to keep a child at the point of separation. There is discrimination on the job market and in the workplace as well. For the youth, the same against social and cultural restrictions. For the minorities, Baluchistan, for instance, one of the places, that's the province near Pakistan, southeast Iran, is the poorest region of Iran. There is a lack of investment in the Kurdish towns as well. And there are obviously socioeconomic grievances among Iranian working families. So while the poverty rate in Iran was 60%, and I'm counting poverty rate earning less than $6.7 a day, was 60% in the 1980s. It declined in the 90s and early 2000s, but then started to increase again. And the blue line, by the way, gives you the rural poverty line, right? So in rural areas, the poverty has been increasing more considerably than in the urban areas. That's definitely to do with inflation, to which I will return shortly, but also it is due to the environmental crisis, the drought that I was mentioning in Iran. But yes, inflation has caused many of this poverty. And inflation has many causes, right? In the short run, you have been confronting inflation here as well. After the Ukraine war started and the food prices went up. In the same month, in March 2022, the government slashed food and basic stuff subsidies, and therefore food prices have been gone as well. So food prices jumped with 25% from April to May 2022. Point-to-point inflation for food products was 86% in July 2022. And it reached 84% in a province like Sistan and Baluchistan. There are long-term causes for the high inflation as well. One of them, again, is corruption of the government, mismanagement of the economy, and lack of productivity and investments in the economy. But economic sanctions imposed by the US have played an important role as well. So the blue line gives you the rate of inflation. And obviously, again, as a historian, I compare, like the corruption in Iran has been constant in the last 40 years. So we cannot explain why at one point it goes more up. And if, as you see, from 2010 to 2012, when the first round of sanctions were imposed due to Iran's nuclear program, you see the inflation increase rapidly. And again, when the Trump administration started reimposing the inflations in 2018, there is a high increase in inflation as well. Moreover, neoliberal restructuring of labor relations has created precarity for workers and has undermined their collective power. Companies and public institutions have started outsourcing many of their activities, and the number of employment agencies has increased dramatically. As a result, more than 90% of current employment contracts of blue-collar workers are temporary. 90%. This has not only caused job insecurity, but it has also undermined workers' collective organization because, you know, their bargaining power diminishes when your employer can sack you at any minute. It is important to note that these grievances are rooted in unequal and exploitative class, gender, and ethnic relations, and therefore they are very intersectional. For instance, youth unemployment has increased considerably in the last 2 decades, reaching around 30% for men and 50% for women. Due to unemployment, low wages, and high rents, being 38% for men and 33% for women in the age group of 25 to 34. And therefore, they stay living with their parents, because if you can't, find a job, your payment is too low, so you have to stay living with your parents. I imagine if you're 34, you wouldn't like that, right? It is important to note that these grievances rooted, I have to go to the next paragraph. Similarly, women have been not only confronted with exclusion and sexual harassment in the public space, but also on the job market and in the workplace. This is reflected in Iran's low female labor force participation, which, while increasing from less than 10% in the 1980s to nearly 20% in 2018, is still one of the lowest in the world. And that has everything to do with the discriminatory policies towards women. This figure doesn't include many women who work in the informal sector, where they struggle with precarity and discrimination. The same pattern is visible among workers in Iran's ethnic communities, such as the Kurds and the Baluchis. Maybe some of you have heard the stories of the Kurdish workers smuggling products in the border of Iran and Iraq, being shot at, working in very difficult conditions where there are snows on the mountain, in dangerous situations as well. So one of the elements that makes the recent protests different is the convergence of these different grievances, right? Of what is happening socioculturally, those restrictions, of what is happening to the women, of what is happening socioeconomically. And all of those are coming together. And I think that makes these differences a little different than the protests we have seen in the last few years. For instance, I mentioned already 2009, right? Those were protests that emerged against fraudulent elections. People were calling for fair elections. Where is my vote? Was one of the main demands. So it was very much about kind of political demands. Then there were protests in December 2017 and January 2018, and then again in November 2019. Those protests were very much a reaction to the immediately increasing inflation, and therefore socioeconomic demands dominated those protests. And therefore, demands were a bit separate. Now we are seeing that political demands are converging with the socioeconomic demands as well. And with that process, we are also seeing the convergence of different social groups and classes. Again, look, all social movements have to mobilize a very kind of different set of the population. So there is always some diversity in them. But some groups dominate them. So in 2009, it was mainly the middle class in Iran that was participating in these protests. And therefore, you saw that the protests were mainly taking place in Tehran, while many of the smaller cities, rural areas, not much was happening. Now, if you look at what was happening in 2017 and 2019, Tehran was relatively silent, and most of these protests were taking place in small cities, in rural areas, and so on. But again, I showed you the map of Iran this time. It was all over, across the country, both in Tehran, in bigger cities, in rural areas, and so on. Therefore, so you see women being at the forefront of these protests, but men have joined them as well. And that brings me to who is actually protesting, right? So again, obviously because of these sociocultural pressures, women are really leading these protests, as you can see, for instance, on many of the pictures. The youth plays a very important role as well. Especially in high schools, schools, and universities. Also because those are places where people can connect, can build networks over many years, and can then organize. And also youth tend to participate more in demonstrations and protests because they are willing to take more risks. Hint, hint, hint. Guys? All right. So, the protests have been also large in the Kurdish areas and towns. Again, by the way, because it is a place where there is a tradition of political organization, trade union building, and so on. But very importantly, and I already referred to this a little bit, there is this, what I call fragile alliance between middle class and working class youth on neighborhood level in Iran that are coming together and recognizing each other's grievances, especially because the middle class has been impoverishing as well over the last few years. So which forms of action, or to use the scientific term, action repertoires, are these protests using? A variety of means, right? Demonstrations, you have seen them on the streets. Building barricades, so I have pictures of here, women at the forefront. Burning headscarves, as the picture to your left shows. Building barricades, as the picture on the right shows. Demonstrations, public burning of the symbols of the state, such as photographs of Ayatollah Khamenei or his predecessor Khomeini, setting on fire or attacking buildings of the Basij, the paramilitary that is responsible for the crackdown of the protests. So those are some of the important action repertoires. But as the repression increased, chanting slogans from balconies and windows, using funerals, became important as well, or as tossing a mullah's kind of turban from his hat was used as well. By the way, some of these repertoires
go back to the Iranian Revolution of 79. We have also seen an outpouring of protest art. There have been lots of graffitis that people are making, posters, songs, I already provided an example, and performance art. And an important action, obviously, that is very powerful, potentially, is the strike, worker strike or the general strike. Because as the protest continued and people were feeling that they are going onto the street, but that they probably need something more powerful as an instrument to confront the state, the calls to organize a general strike or to go on strike started to increase, especially because people, of course, have the memory of the Iranian Revolution of 79, during which there were also protests for 6-7 months. And then in the fall of 1978, workers started to join the revolution and went on strike, and there was a mass strike in the oil industry. So this really invokes for many Iranians the picture of, if this time around again there would be a general strike or mass strikes, we can actually win from the state. But it is, of course, important to see what really happened on the ground. So I have made a graph, because that's my hobby, of the strikes. The blue ones I got from an organization that has been counting the strikes from kind of September to January on a daily basis, right? Those are the blue lines. And the orange ones, I had nothing to do better, so I started collecting them myself with the help of an assistant, and just to be able to compare. What you see that there are obviously some peaks here, and in November there are peaks because there was a call for a general strike around 23, 4, and 5 of November, and again on 5th of December. So there are some peaks. But the problem is that these number of strikes are between 6 and 4 daily. And I have been, as a labor historian, looking to strikes for the past 40 years, and more specifically last 4 years as well. These strikes are unfortunately not considerably higher than what we have seen in the four years on an average, on a weekly average, right? So we do see an increase. We do see that some workers did see the protest as an opportunity to also raise their grievances, but that the strikes did not peak considerably. By the way, at the very end, you see a very high peak. That's a strike by protests by Iranian oil workers for recognition of their status and wage increases. So there's also the difference between socioeconomic demands and political demands, obviously. What did happen in terms of strike was the Shopkeepers Strike. That was much more considerable than the labor strikes, because it's also easier to close off your shop than go on a strike where you're much more vulnerable to the employer, to the state. So the call for the general strike in 5 December, there you see a peak that there were kind of, in more than 60 cities, there were events of shopkeepers closing their shops. But I mean, by the way, this does not mean that in all of these cities, all shops were closed, but in some sections of the cities. The problem, however, is that although symbolically important, shopkeeper strikes does not have a great impact on the state and on the economy, right? A strike by oil workers, that would have a huge impact. By industrial workers, by more strategic sectors like transportation, teachers, nurses, and so on, would have been much more important. So the second question I want to address is, how did we get at this point? By the way, if you have any questions in details, try to remember them so we can get back to them at the Q&A. I want to move to the second big question of how did we get here? The Islamic Republic was born out of social and political contradictions and institutionalized them in its very fabric. What were these contradictions? Well, the Islamic Republic was born out of a very popular revolution. 11% of the population actually participated in the 1979 population. But the people that grabbed power after the revolution, around Ayatollah Khomeini, the clerics, they really wanted to establish a more theocratic state that gave clerics all power. And they succeeded in doing this partially. And I'm saying partially because they actually had to make concessions to the population who had been going on streets and organizing strikes and so on. So, and a parliament was instituted as well. A presidency was instituted as well. And there were elections for those institutions, even if limited, because the people who can be candidates for these positions are filtered, right? There was an example of somebody not being able to get in the city council because of not meeting, right, the requirements. But nevertheless, these were institutions that created some counterbalance to the power of the clerics and created some channels of voicing dissent towards the regime. And therefore, we see that actually, that actually, if you look throughout the past of elections in Iran, participation in the elections, turnout, has varied. At points that there was some opening in the system and there were some hopes of change, such as in 2009, 85% of the population turned out in the elections. Or if you look at 1997, when the reformist president Khatami was elected, there was a turnout of 80%. But look at what happens in 2021. When they had filtered out so many of the candidates that the choice was really limited, many Iranians said, you know what, I'm not participating in these elections. And there was a huge disappointment with the whole entire electoral system because you participate in the elections, but they do what they want, right? But it is important to take this into account. The revolution was thus, as it were, a fishbone that the Islamic Republic swallowed and which has come to stuck and block its airway. What I mean by that is because of repressing the popular forces of the revolution, it keeps haunting them. The voices of the people come back because the revolution was very popular, because the demands of the revolution were in fact sovereignty for Iran. They were about social equality. They were about freedom. But those demands were obviously repressed in the aftermath of the revolution. So then what happened in the 1980s, the government could stay in power through mechanisms of repression. For instance, there was the mass kind of executions in the 1980s, during which several thousands of mainly leftist political activists were murdered. There was obviously the Iran-Iraq war that kind of created pressures of nationalism, and they could say, listen, there is a war. Let's not talk about, disagreements. And the population was mobilized. But I must say, it's more complicated than that, because the revolution and what was happening in the 1980s also created social mobility for many people from the rural areas who could actually take up those positions in the government, in the state bureaucracy that was expanding, right? Because every state builds its own elite, right? And bureaucracy. So during the Shah, many of those people actually left, fled Iran, and those positions could be filled. Also, the government took some developmental projects, initiating schools, water supply, electrifying villages, and so on. So social inequality actually decreased relatively in those years. So there was what I call a populist social contract in the 1980s. It was a social contract in the terms of you don't have much political freedoms, but in terms of social mobility and improving your lives, you are getting some concessions, right? But that social contract has been unraveling since the early 1990s when President Rafsanjani was elected as a president and started this kind of pro-market restructuring of the economy, in which subsidies were slashed. Neoliberal policies were informed, and so on. So that social contract started to disintegrate. But the crisis, again, was not solved. And you saw that the elite in Iran came up with another kind of project. And that project was the reformist project of 1997, in which they said, you know what, we are going to relatively open up the political sphere, allow more newspapers, more political activities, improve the life of women and the youth a little bit, and so on. But for reasons that I will come back to, that project failed as well. And we saw in 2005 the election of Ahmadinejad, who had what I call a new populist kind of rhetoric and project. Like, let's go back to the ideals of the Iranian Revolution. Let's put the oil money on the table of ordinary Iranians, right? But that obviously failed again. And what we have seen between 2013 and 2018 is the project of the nuclear deal as a social project, of a new project. Like, okay, we will have an agreement with the US, the sanctions that I talked about will go away, the Iranians will benefit economically. Again, this has failed as well, not only because of Iran, but also because of what happened in the US. These projects have met with domestic and international obstacles. The domestic obstacles in Iran were obviously the bastions of power of the conservative forces that could actually derail the reformists in the 90s and early 2000s. For instance, the heads of the Revolutionary Guards, that's the main kind of ideologically motivated military wing of the system, wrote a letter to Khatami, President Khatami, actually threatening him of, if you go on with these reforms, we will intervene. Or they would close off kind of these reformist newspapers. They closed off one of them in 1998, and students took to the streets to actually protest it. But there have been, honestly, also foreign obstacles for this. And these are two sides of the same coin. Because US policies and the policies of the West, unfortunately, have been actually part of the problem and not part of the solution. Also, the policies of the West undermined the reformists. For instance, when Khatami was actually trying to put through these reform experiments, you know what happened in 2001 and 2023, right? So Khatami was talking about the dialogue of civilizations, of kind of opening up Iran to the world. And President Bush started the war in Afghanistan and attacked Iraq, and also said Iran is part of the axis of evil. And in Washington, they were actually literally singing, "Bomb, bomb Iran." Everybody wants to go to Baghdad was the joke running in DC, but real men go to Tehran. So when this happened and Iran was encircled by US military, the Revolutionary Guards totally panicked and said, we don't want any experiments with reformism in Iran. We have to kind of block this. So it was both the domestic forces in Iran and also the foreign forces. And this is very important. I'm stressing both of them, because if you would obviously say it is all the fault of the US, you're letting off the hook those responsible in Iran who have been repressing the protests and so on. But also, if you say, no, it is only what happened in Iran, then you're really being blind for the devastating policies of the US in the Middle East, not only in the past a decade or two, but for the last 50, 60 years. So, and I will try to go a bit quicker through my story. Well, this happens with historians, they talk a lot. Forgive me. But I would say that since 2018, I think the regime has lost the plot. There is no coherent narrative. There is no political project as existed before, like the Reform Project, right? Or the New Populist Project. If you listen to them, nobody has a very concrete, big idea about how to push forward the country and get it out of its trouble. The only thing that you see a bit is kind of, again, turning to conservatism. So the current president of Iran, Raisi, who was elected in 2021, he actually started off pushing these kind of conservative ideas, which obviously have backfired, like imposing strict rules of hijab, and we saw the results with the protests, obviously. And there have been many society's responses have been a variety as well. I already mentioned some of them, kind of participating in elections, but also taking on the streets, as happened in 2017, opening up a new era of protests and revolts. Where did I go with my? All right. This brings me to the final question. What is the nature of the current protests and where might they be heading? Although it is too soon to offer any definitive qualification of the women life freedom protests, I characterize them as a revolt with a revolutionary perspective, to differentiate their constraints as an event and their potential as an open-ended process. On the one hand, while representing the biggest political crisis in the Islamic Republic since 1979, the protests didn't reach the critical mass that could draw millions onto the streets and to crack open significant fissures within its political and military elites. Let me unpack both elements of the protests, both their current limits and their potential. To start with the limits, in order to qualify for a revolutionary situation, two elements are required. One is that the size and strength of protests, which have to be big enough to mobilize important sections of the population to join the protest, right? Like, for instance, workers going on strikes, the protests being in their millions. And in that sense, size does matter. Based on a study of a century of campaigns since 1900, Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stephan have argued that it takes, on average, around 3.5% of the population actively participating in the protest to ensure serious political change. In the case of Iran, with 85 million inhabitants, that would be around 3 million people. But given the violent nature of the Islamic Republic and the fact that also it has some sections of the population, a significant minority supporting it, I think these numbers should be even bigger in the case of Iran. More importantly, research shows that general strikes have been very important in forcing change. I already gave the example of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So the question is why the protests didn't grow into hundreds of thousands of millions and remained limited to tens of thousands. One important factor is obviously repression, right? Let's not forget that. About 18,000 people were arrested in the last 4 months. 4 people have already been executed and 109 people are facing execution. There is torture going on in the prisons and so on. But repression is only one factor. Other factor is that many Iranians have stopped believing in the long-term viability of the regime, but they have not yet started believing in the viability of this movement as a revolutionary alternative. This is the gray mass many have talked about. Those Iranians who sympathize with the protest but have not actively joined it.
The reason for this is a relative absence of a clear program, leadership, and credible and concrete strategy of the movement. Take, for instance, the social grievances I have talked about. But we don't see them articulated in the concrete slogans of the movement. So the slogans are very much done with the regime, but they have not yet provided a concrete strategy of which steps are next and which slogans can actually mobilize the majority of the Iranians to win victories and increase the self-confidence of the movement and then push forward the whole movement. In short, the revolt has been unprecedented and many Iranians have shown huge courage in confronting state violence, but it is complicated. I just discussed one requirement of a revolutionary situation that is still absent, the size and the strength of the movement. The second requirement is the emergence of serious cracks within the political and military elites. Again, research shows that successful revolutions emerge when parts of the elite take a neutral position or support the protests. In the last few months, we have seen some serious debates on the margins of the political elite, but we have not yet seen serious defections from it, and certainly not in the Revolutionary Guards. Does all of this mean that the revolt of women, life, freedom has no future? Not at all. The significance of this revolt is that it has created a revolutionary subjectivity among not all, but a significant number of Iranians. This subjectivity is most clearly reflected in two developments. First, the concept of revolution has entered popular discourse as protesters have reclaimed it from the authorities of the Islamic Republic. By defining themselves as revolutionary subjects, protesters have turned the table on those authorities, as they now appear as anti-revolutionaries when repressing the protests. The resurgence of the term revolution has also pushed into oblivion barandazi, overthrow, a term that was promoted by political currents that associated revolution with the overthrow of the Shah in 1979, but denied this was the work of a popular movement and aimed to introduce a strategy of ambiguity about the subject of radical change, so that it could be a foreign power, that it could be a king, that it could be the people, it could be some kind of intervention from outside, and so on. This movement has turned the gaze to the agency of ordinary people in Iran of what is happening from below. So the Women, Life, Freedom protests represent, for the time being, a revolt and not a revolution, but they have introduced a revolutionary perspective, revolution as a possibility, into popular political imaginary. Second, revolutionary subjectivity is expressed in the shifting mentalities regarding politics, culture, and gender ethnic relations. The concerns and demands of subaltern groups, including women, ethnic minorities such as Kurds, Baluchis, and Arabs, and workers have moved from the periphery to the center of mainstream political discourse. The calls for a general strike that resulted in increased strike activity in October-December have also drawn attention to the conditions and agency of labor in Iran and have created the possibility of creating international solidarity with women, workers, and discriminated minorities in other regions and countries, including the West. Thank you for your attention.
So we have some time for questions, discussion. I have the microphone. I'm not sure if I can reach everybody, but is anybody there who has a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Anwar Al-Burayhi. I am asylum seeker here in Maastricht. I have a comment, it's not a question. It's about the benefits between the West and Iran. Iran benefits from the West when they involved in Iraq. Iran expanded. So now Iran is controlling Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Yemen. This is why we are here, asylum seekers. And the West at the same time benefits from Iran. Because there is an enemy, we need to control the Gulf-rich oil countries and to sell the weapons. So I don't see any conflict. between the West or Iran. Any comment?
Maybe we can collect another question and then I will try to bundle them.
Right. My question kind of feeds into his question because, as you know, the IRGC was pronounced as a terrorist group, and Iran's doing the same mechanism. Now, to me personally, I would say that is a kind of a declaration of a war. But also, we have Bibi back in Israel cooking up a new strike plan, as he said himself, and the JCPOA is dead. So I would say that there's a high chance of Iran building a nuclear bomb because of the Emad project, for example, if you have heard of it. So I would say, and plus, adding to that, Russia selling Su-35s and S-400s by March to Iran. So adding all these factors together, I personally think not only there is a conflict, but actually a threat of strike within the coming months that is quite likely, I believe, and actually could boost the Iranian protests as it did, for example, during the World Cups when Iran lost to America and people were celebrating. So that is my position, at least what I think that might happen. So,
well, we have here two quite different positions. So one is Iran and the West actually need each other, and the other is there is a conflict and coming together. And as well, I think both are true. Because there is obviously a conflict, and I do want to focus on that a little bit. Because, you know, before the Iranian Revolution, Iran was very well aligned with the US, right? It was importing for billions of dollars of American weapons, just as Saudi Arabia is now doing nowadays, like for literally, I forgot what it has been, but one of the years in the last years, it was like $80 billion of weapons exported from the US to Saudi Arabia. So since the revolution, Iran has become an obstacle for the power projection of the US in the Middle East. I think that is a fact. The US also tried to support Saddam Hussein in the Iraq war. And, you know, there has been animosity. And by the way, and I think the Iranian regime has totally perverted the slogan of the Iranian Revolution, which was in opposition to American imperialism and demanding sovereignty, but they have gone too far as kind of opposing anything of the West, culturally, technology, kind of relationships and so on. That's why I'm using the word perversion of that, because there's nothing wrong with the demand of, you know, opposing American domination of the region. So I do think there is a conflict there, but obviously it doesn't mean that they do not benefit from each other. I don't know where you're sitting. Yes. So I do agree, and I think it is worth pointing that out as well. And also the reason why they benefit from each other, because at the bottom of it, all these regimes, like the Iranian regime, Saudi Arabian regime, all of them, their biggest enemy is their own population. They hate their own population making demands. The Saudis are quiet about what is happening in Iran. They have been imprisoning kind of women rights activists. Public segregation has been going on in Saudi Arabia. Women did not even have the right to drive cars, etc. I'm bringing this up because there is, first of all, a point of hypocrisy here, right? Because whoever is the enemy of the US gets picked up and has to abide to human rights rules, but those who are friends and to whom we can sell weapons, we won't talk about them. At this very moment, I talked about 18,000 people imprisoned in Iran. And I'm, by the way, also making this point as a Iranian-Dutch person, because I always think that there is much more solidarity needed in the Middle East between the countries.
there is unfortunately a wall between Iran and the Arab countries. It's a matter of language, but it is also a matter of ideology and nationalism and so on. And I think those walls have to be broken down. And therefore, I'm pointing out that the situation in Iran is terrible, but as we speak, there are 60,000 people imprisoned in Egypt. When the 2011 revolution happened, it was followed by a coup d'etat, right? Financed by Saudi Arabia and green-lighted by the US. In one day, 800 Egyptians were murdered in Cairo. So when we talk about human rights, we have to be consistent. And we have to see that there is common ground between the people of the Middle East and exposing, indeed, the foreign powers that have been benefiting from each other. And let me also point out the devastating role of Iran in repressing the revolution in Syria, in the resistance that was developing in the early days in Syria, of Iran's kind of power projection in Iraq and in other countries. So that has been very harmful as well. But I think in order to break that, what is needed is that the people of the Middle East actually understand that they need each other other's solidarity, and that the foreign powers actually do not give a lot about human rights and what happens to democracy and to their future, as long as they can do their own competition, because a lot of it about what happens with China, US-China competition, as long as they can sell their weapons and so on. So I think it really is important, amidst all these debates, to keep the focus on the agency of ordinary people in the Middle East, because that's the future.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Good to see you here, Peyman. We know each other for 20 years onward or so. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of the Shoras in the 1979 revolution? I think it had a major impact back then, but one of the conclusions that we have to draw, I think, is that there was no coordination between the Shoras. Maybe you can explain this better than me to the audience, because I noticed that you said that there's also no coordination. If I interpret you correctly right now, you have the protests. Of course, they are organized by people on the ground, but there's nobody looking forward what the next step could be. So I draw the conclusion that the situation basically is the same. I mean, there's no Shoras right now, of course, but there's no kind of organization trying to have this kind of overview, so to say. But then again, it adds up to what you're just saying, actually, but these boundaries should be broken down within the region, so to say. But it's very nice to know that people in Sudan are looking toward drawing the lessons of the Egypt revolution. And now you see, 5,000, how are they called, resistance committees are on neighborhood level are organizing themselves against their regime. Are the people in Iran looking at Sudan? That's my question, basically. Long introduction. Thank you very much.
Maybe we can have another question, so I can take them.
Hello. Okay, so you just mentioned that you think that Arab countries need to show more solidarity towards Iran. And I also wanted to ask you about the proxy groups that Iran has in other countries in the Middle East, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. So I was wondering, especially since, okay, so my first question is, do you think that the solidarity that the West chose to Iran is sort of a face and not, how do you say it, genuine, if that makes sense, is performative? That's my first question. Second question, talking about these proxy groups in the Middle East, what measures should the Arab population living in those countries who are being subjugated to Iran's influence should do in order to help the current movement, the women life freedom movement? And yeah, if that makes sense.
Thank you for those questions. Let me actually start from there and then go back to your question. Well, when it comes the support of the West, look, again, I emphasize that there are interests involved here, right? Because at the moment there is a nuclear deal that is on the table. Iran has not accepted it. The US actually walked out of it when President Trump was elected, right, in 2016, and then kind of withdrew the US out of it. And they are using these protests to kind of twist the arm of Iran and say, you are in a weak position and you have to sign the nuclear deal. So in that sense, if they get the chance to do it, there is actually a possibility that there will be a nuclear deal and European and American governments will change their tone. My point is, this is something that Iranians cannot count on. They have to count and build on themselves instead of expecting about what is happening with these political games at the international level, and also expose actually the solidarity of the West, because. Again, I emphasize, and this is where I'm coming personally from. You don't have to agree with me, but I'm an internationalist, right? I'm not a nationalist. I think solidarity has to be international. And for instance, as Iranian living in the US, I think it is very important when talking about women's rights in Iran to actually solidarize with the women in the US who are fighting the assault on abortion right. Because otherwise what happens, you have all these Republicans saying women's rights in Iran, great, we are all in favor of that. And we have to sanction Iran, we have to do this and we have to do that. Well, my question is, at the same time, you are assaulting a women's bodily autonomy in your own country, and therefore I have to, just because you oppose Iran, I have to go and take a picture with you, I have to support you, I have to campaign for you, and then make sure that American women's rights are being trumped and in favor of the Iranians' rights. That's not okay. I think there has to be solidarity both ways. And therefore, maybe I was misunderstood. I did not say that people in Arab countries should support Iran, because again, I think that is something that Arab people should say, right? I cannot determine that for them. As somebody coming from Iran, I am saying Iranians actually have to look to the Arab Revolution. They have to look at what happened in Sudan, the example that was rightly mentioned, and also the question that you raised, like Iran's proxies in the region, and criticize them, criticize Iran's role in Iraq, criticize Iran's role in Lebanon and in Syria. But I do also want to emphasize, as the gentleman did earlier, that some of this has happened not in a vacuum, right? Iran started doing this because actually the US destabilized the region. And Iran does not have the same means to fight back against the US in terms of military or economic means. So what they do is asymmetrical war, right? They say, okay, you can hit us, but we can hit you back by supporting this or that group. So it is a symmetrical war, and as we criticize Iran for doing that, we also have to look at the global roots of this conflict. And again, it is about global power projection that the global powers have been doing. Not only, by the way, the US, Russia has been doing it as well in the region and elsewhere. We have been talking a lot about what is happening globally, so therefore I am happy with that question about the shuras, but I'm sure nobody knows what shura means here, maybe one or two. It means councils. It is about how people organize and create councils on factory level or on neighborhood level to kind of organize themselves. So that happened during the Iranian Revolution.
And there have been some strikes in Iran, and during some of the strikes recently, people have actually raised that slogan as well. So I do not have a ready-made answer because, again, I think this is something that people in Iran have to kind of figure out as they are facing the challenge of the government. But I do think the focus should be shifted to those kind of issues. How are people organizing? If organization on neighborhood level is important and there is repression, how can people navigate that repression and start to organize on neighborhood? Maybe there is a need for neighborhood level committees, right? And they can solidarize with factory committees and self-organizations. So those are important questions that I cannot prescribe to the Iranians, but we can all be part of the conversation. Also looking to other countries, Sudan is a great example, Egypt is a great example, because all of these protests and revolutions, unfortunately, did not deliver because they did not have the ideas and the organizations that could really break with the past. And I think that is something we can learn for the future.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious to know if you think a new version of the Iran nuclear deal is possible. There were some talks, I think, last year or 2 years ago. I have not heard much since then. And what would the implications be if Iran were to get nuclear weapons for the stability of the Middle East, for example?
Can we have another question? Maybe?
Thank you, first of all, for the lecture. And I wanted to ask, you already kind of touched upon U.S. sanctions and the efficacy of U.S. sanctions against Iran. And I wanted to ask, how efficient do you think that these sanctions actually are for, you already said that they kind of take a toll on the upper and lower class of, middle class, sorry, of Iran, and not actually do anything at state level. And so how efficient or useful do you think that these sanctions are? And if they're not useful, what kind of other means does the international community have to kind of not turn a blind eye on human rights violations? Thank you.
Can we have one more, because I want to give the room as much as possible?
That was my question.
So as many of the young students here, I use social media, and a lot of information about the protest has been spread over Instagram or TikTok, both I think on a regional level in Iran, but also internationally. And with the internet in Iran being continuously suppressed, how do you think the protests will develop? And do you think they have the potential of getting bigger if the communication between the different communities is so difficult?
Okay, all great questions. I will try to be really brief about them. So the nuclear deal, I think in the short term it's going to be very difficult because Iran is cracking down on the population. Nobody at the moment wants to kind of have a deal with Iran. But there are pressures to move towards a nuclear deal anyway. And here I'm repeating the head of Israel's military secret service, former head of its service, because the journalist asked him, like, okay, what can we do? Then what is a plan B? And he said, basically, if Iran is attacked by Israel, and that is why it hasn't happened until now, Iran will retreat from the non-proliferation treaty, right? And start actually building a nuclear deal, because military attacks can delay Iran's nuclear program, but they cannot destroy it totally. And that would give Iran an excuse to actually move towards a weapons program, which it doesn't have right now, right? It has a nuclear program, but not a weapons program. And so it is very difficult. So I think the pressures to actually move towards some kind of a nuclear deal are actually large, because many European and American politicians have been saying, like, well, it would be great if the Iranian regime can collapse and disappear. Then we wouldn't deal with a nuclear issue. But if that doesn't happen, we want to make sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear bomb, right? That is the interest that is on the table. When it comes to sanctions, again, I wouldn't talk about it now or anybody else about taking the sanctions now off the table. But I have always argued, and this is a issue of contention, by the way, among Iranians themselves as well, because some Iranians have argued it is good to sanction economically the state because there is corruption in Iran, and they are kind of, the people won't get the money if the government starts selling oil and so on. My argument has been based on the literature on sanctions. First of all, comparative literature shows that they are ineffective. Look at North Korea, look at Cuba, look at Venezuela for the last 10 years. They actually, and Iran itself, by the way, has been under sanctions for the last 40 years and under crippling sanctions, as they call them in DC, for the last kind of 10, 15 years, right? And it has not given in. So what actually sanctions do, and that is why I am against economic sanctions that hurt the people, is that they actually strengthen the regime, the most hardline elements of the regime, through several means. First of all, they help them militarize because they say there is a foreign threat, the military has to be expanded, they have to get more means, and so on. Moreover, what do sanctions do? They expand the black market. Who benefits in a country like Iran from the black market? Those who have ties with the government, right? So they can actually import goods. The Revolutionary Guards control the borders of Iran and the ports, so they can actually import stuff and get richer and increase their share of the economy. And on the other hand, what does it do to the ordinary people? I already showed you, this is not a joke, when inflation actually increases, the ordinary people's lives becomes hard. There has been even shortages of medicine in Iran, not because medicine was kind of targeted by the sanctions, but because getting money out of Iran for paying for those medicine became more difficult. And moreover, sanctions, even if they create anger and the population rises up, because they help disintegrate the social fabric of a society, even if a regime collapses, the chances of a democracy being built on the ruins of such a devastated society is very little. And for that, I have an example. Look at Iraq in the 1990s. The US sanctions against Iraq devastated Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi kids actually died because of the sanctions. Mortality increased. And when even Saddam Hussein disappeared, civil society had become weak. So this is not an ideological issue. It is a very practical one about sanctions actually helping regimes and weakening governments. I know this is very counterintuitive because especially if you feel weak against the Iranian regime, you think, somebody should, smash the regime through sanctions or whatever. That's an instinct, but I don't think that the history actually show that it works. Moving to the internet and protests. Internet has been a very important way of organizing social media, but I wouldn't give too much kind of credit to it. People have been organizing through their neighborhood networks, through their phones, through kind of Telegram and so on, not necessarily internet kind of social networks like Twitter. There will be other ways of doing it. But yes, obviously, one effect of it has been already that we are getting less pictures out of Iran because of the slowdown of the internet. That has an impact in Iran as well. But I think there is a possibility to kind of bypass that by creating underground organizations in Iran.
I'm an old student. You mentioned the Shah once. Pahlavi. I always say Pahlavi. His son lives in exile in the US. Has he got any influence among Iranians within and outside Iran? I think he has no influence.
Do we have room for one more question? And
Yes, maybe the last question. So when you were showing the history of what happened, I thought first there was some indication that sanctions cause inflation, and then at the end you concluded whenever there was increasing rate of inflation for some years, then there were more and more protests. And if the final thing that is happening these days is a good thing, then did you want, does that imply that the sanctions actually caused what we see now, or it was a misunderstanding?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Well, with the Shah question, you actually touched on a very hot topic. We were discussing this at dinner as well, because I have talked a lot also about like regime stability and instability and so on, but how does it look on the side of the movement, right? What are the organizations, oppositional figures, and so on? First of all, there are lots of, inside of Iran, human rights activists, lawyers, who are actually now in prison, like Nasrin Sotoudeh, and even like reformist figures like Tajzadeh, but also labor activists like Shahabi. He's the leader of the Tehran kind of bus drivers. There are lots of leading figures. Outside of Iran, obviously the former son of the Shah is an important figure. And recently a number of people started a campaign to give him power of attorney to represent Iranians to the international community and international leaders. Unfortunately, actually that has created huge divisions among the opposition in Iran, the movement. Because, for instance, the ethnic minorities, the Kurds and the Baluchis, are saying, listen, our marginalization is very bad under the Islamic Republic, but it didn't start there. It started already under the Pahlavis, right? The repression of the Kurds and the Baluchis and so on. And you are hijacking the movement while we are protesting on the streets. For the same reason, people who are not monarchists and Republicans are saying the same. Like, we don't want, again, one kind of person to kind of lead this movement, while this movement was about what ordinary people are actually doing on the ground. So the criticism has been that while actually the women life freedom movement turned the focus on what is happening from below, from the population, on the streets, on those struggles, and what is happening inside Iran, that's point B, right? This move has shifted the gaze outside of Iran, like the diaspora and the son of the Shah, and away from the power of the movement to what can foreign powers do for us. Because the whole goal is that the son of the former Shah should go and negotiate with international political leaders. So it has actually become very contentious and has already damaged the movement in the sense of, some people are saying, well, if we are going to end up again with a Shah, I'm not part of this movement, actually, because we saw what happened in 1979 when one person kind of pulled all power towards himself. And obviously, the former son of the Shah says, like, no, this is only about negotiations, and later there will be elections, and you can say what you want. But some people are skeptic because Khomeini said very beautiful stuff before coming into power as well. Sanctions and protests, right? I think, listen, these protests actually started around the issue of women, right? Of the death of Mahsa Amini. So I think there is not necessarily a causality there. I do think that the sanctions have increased the misery of ordinary Iranians. And obviously, an increasing number of people will also protest, because that was the logic, especially in the Trump administration, of like, we increase the level of sanctions, the Iranians will become poor and they will revolt against their own government. My point is that even if they revolt and protest, the chances of that protest of being well organized and leading to a democracy diminishes because of sanctions. I will actually give you concrete examples. Like, for instance, I have been talking to many workers in Iran, asking them actually, why didn't you join the strikes? Their argument was, I cannot afford missing a day of salary because I have been impoverished. Previously, if you have actually worked and you have reserves, financial reserves for a week, a month or 2 months, you can actually go on strike because there are no strike funds in Iran, right? Or before, your family could actually send money into Iran. And this is, by the way, very, very cynical and ironic. This former son of the Shah is actually trying to say, yeah, the strikes didn't get off the ground because there is no strike fund. So we need a strike fund in Iran. So I want to collect money to send it to Iran. Well, you can't because there are sanctions. So now they are campaigning for getting an exemption of the sanctions to be able to send money to Iran. So if you're going to get an exemption of the sanctions, why don't allow ordinary Iranians that were already sending money to their families, which is a more effective way actually because there are small amounts. How are you going to distribute the funds to the people? Like, it's very concrete actually, how on a very concrete level it doesn't match. And again, when there is lively civil society, there can be organizations that can create a more democratic future. Because otherwise we would have revolution all the time in the poorest countries, right? And that's not the case. People actually, when they are at a certain level, they can organize much better in order to kind of fight for a... Because you can have a kind of a explosion of anger, but it doesn't mean that there is kind of a programmatic underpinning, organizational underpinning, and a scenario for the future. So I think it is much better to, again, invest in ordinary Iranians.
Thank you. Thank you.